when my sister texted, "Be here before 9 in the morning. The kids are your job." She thought it was just another chore. She had no idea I knew about the scheme they had secretly built behind my back for months. That Thanksgiving night, I did not ruin their dinner. I simply pulled the tablecloth off their lies. The biggest explosion did not come from a scream, but from a single text sent exactly as they raised their glasses. "My name is Morgan Morales. I am 34 years old, and I live alone in a light gray townhouse in Millstone Ridge, Pennsylvania. I bought it myself. Every month, the mortgage payment leaves my bank account on the first day, precise and unquestioned. I like it that way. I live a quiet, disciplined life. Everything in my home has its place, from the neatly stacked mail on the entryway console to the organized spice rack in the kitchen. Above all else, I despise the feeling of owing anyone anything. Debt, whether it is financial or emotional, is a heavy coat I refuse to wear. Let me tell you about my townhouse. It is not grand, but it is entirely mine. I spent 3 months painting the walls that specific shade of light gray because it brings me peace. The hardwood floors took me 2 weekends to refinish by myself. When I sit in my living room on a Sunday morning, the silence is not lonely. It is a hard-won victory. Every piece of furniture, from the mid-century modern armchair to the solid oak dining table, represents hours spent reviewing contract clauses and negotiating compliance terms. I know the value of $1 because I track every single one I earn. I do not have a financial safety net. I am my own safety net. During the week, I work as a contract compliance coordinator for Ravenport Transit Solutions. It is an infrastructure company where a single misplaced comma in a vendor agreement can cost thousands of dollars. My job is to catch the mistakes other people try to hide. It is stable work, but the pressure is relentless. By the time the holidays roll around, I crave my rare days off with a desperation I can barely articulate. All I ever want is to sit on my couch with a cup of hot coffee and watch the snow fall, owing nothing to the clock or to anyone else. But then there is my sister, Delaney Bishop. Delaney is 4 years older than me and lives a life that looks like it was clipped straight from the pages of a high-end lifestyle magazine. She resides in Ash Creek Estates, a wealthy, manicured suburb where the driveways are always perfectly paved and the lawns never seem to die. She lives there with her husband, Everett, and their 2 young children. From the outside, the Bishop family is the epitome of the successful American dream. They are polite, perfectly dressed, and always eager to host. What the neighbors do not see, however, is the scaffolding holding that perfect image up. For years, I have been that scaffolding. I have been the one quietly filling the holes Delaney leaves behind. It started small. A quick text asking me to front the money for a birthday present because her credit card was temporarily maxed out. Then it became picking up the slack for holiday meals. She would say, "Could you grab the artisan bread and the expensive cheeses? Just put it on your card. I will pay you back." She never did. Over time, it escalated. I became the unofficial, unpaid event coordinator for her flawless gatherings. I paid for the folding chairs when she ran short. I bought the elaborate floral centerpieces. 2 years ago, I even put down a $500 catering deposit when she forgot to secure the vendor in time, a deposit that somehow dissolved into the ether, never to be mentioned or refunded by her or Everett. At Ravenport Transit Solutions, if a vendor tries to sneak in an unauthorized charge of $50, I catch it and I penalize them. My professional life is defined by strict boundaries and absolute accountability. Yet, in my personal life, I have somehow allowed myself to become an open tab. My parents, Paula and Gerald Morales, see nothing wrong with this dynamic. In their eyes, I am simply the child without her own family. Because I do not have a husband or children of my own, they have collectively decided that my time and resources are infinitely flexible. My mother would often pat my hand and say that I have so much freedom and that it is so good of me to help my sister because she is just so overwhelmed with the kids. It always sounds like a compliment. It is not. It is a hall pass. It is the family's official license to use me. They have mistaken my independence for a surplus of energy and money that rightfully belongs to them. Thanksgiving is always the worst offender. Every single year, Delaney claims the title of the elegant, gracious hostess. She floats around the kitchen island in a silk blouse, pouring wine for the adults and laughing at all the right jokes. And where am I? Pushed down into the basement, I am relegated to the playroom or the den, surrounded by a swirling tornado of sticky fingers, spilled juice, and crying toddlers. I am expected to watch not only her 2 children, but the children of whatever guests she has invited to showcase her perfect life. I remember Thanksgiving 3 years ago with crystal clarity. I had worked a 60-hour week, finalizing a massive municipal transit contract. I was exhausted to my very bones. I showed up at Delaney's house carrying a homemade pumpkin pie that took me 4 hours to bake from scratch. Instead of a greeting, Delaney handed me a stack of coloring books and pointed toward the basement stairs. She did not even make eye contact as she adjusted a decorative gourd, merely instructing me to keep the rambunctious twins out of the formal living room until dessert. I spent 4.5 hours in that basement. I ate a plate of lukewarm turkey balanced on my knees, while preventing a 3-year-old from eating a crayon. When I finally came upstairs, my mother looked at me and called me a good, helpful girl. It felt like a physical slap. I was 31 years old at the time, an established professional, being patted on the head for providing free childcare. Lately, I have realized that the money, the hundreds of dollars drained away on artisan cheeses and catering deposits, is not actually the thing that hurts the most. Money can be earned back. What hollows me out is the profound disrespect. My family treats my time, my physical effort, and my very presence as a default assignment. They do not ask if I want to help. They merely inform me of my duties. I am not a guest at their table. I am the backstage crew, expected to ensure the leading lady shines without ever stepping into the spotlight myself. This year, however, I could feel a shift in the air. This Thanksgiving is different. It is not just the usual gathering of neighbors and cousins. Everett recently found out he is up for a major promotion at his corporate firm. To secure it, he decided to use the holiday dinner to impress his regional boss and the boss's wife, both of whom accepted the invitation to dine at Ash Creek Estates. The moment Delaney announced this in the family group chat, her obsession with the perfect family image dialed up to a frantic, feverish pitch. The menu was suddenly entirely revamped to include things like duck fat roasted potatoes and a heritage turkey. The table setting had to be professionally sourced. And right from the start, a cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I had a terrible premonition. I knew my sister. I knew the lengths she would go to in order to project absolute perfection to a man who held her husband's career in his hands. This year, they did not just want my help in the kitchen or my credit card at the bakery. They wanted more. The bad feeling washed over me as I looked at the calendar, realizing that to achieve the sophisticated, adult-only ambiance Delaney desperately needed for this executive dinner, she would require the children to be entirely invisible, which meant she needed me to be invisible, too. She did not just want me to babysit. She wanted me to completely disappear from the dining table to serve as the hidden machinery operating her flawless stage. They expected me to swallow my pride, sacrifice my holiday, and vanish into the basement for the entirety of the evening, all so Delaney and Everett could clink crystal glasses with regional directors and pretend their lives were completely effortless. The expectation was no longer an annoyance. It was an insult. I could see the trap being laid out in front of me, meticulously planned by a sister who viewed me not as family, but as a heavily discounted, highly reliable utility. They thought my silence over the years was submission. They thought my willingness to keep the peace meant I had no breaking point. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. Exactly 7 days before the holiday, my phone vibrated against the marble countertop of my kitchen island. I had just finished my morning routine and was pouring a cup of black coffee, preparing to review a stack of vendor contracts for the day. The screen illuminated with a notification from the group chat named Bishop Family Thanksgiving. Delaney had dropped a file into the thread. It was not a casual link to a recipe or a quick question regarding dietary restrictions. It was a brightly colored, aggressively detailed digital spreadsheet exported as a high-resolution image. I opened the document, my eyes scanning the meticulously color-coded rows and columns. My sister had always treated hosting like a military deployment, but this particular document crossed the line from overly organized to utterly delusional. The column on the far left dictated the strict timeline for the day. At 8:30 in the morning, the spreadsheet demanded my physical arrival at the Ash Creek Estates property. At 9 o'clock flat, my assigned task was to set up the kids' room, a space she had euphemistically labeled the activity den in a playful cursive font. By 11 in the morning, I was scheduled to wait by the secondary garage door to receive the heavy warming trays and bulk food orders, while Delaney supposedly managed the aesthetic floral preparations in the main dining room. From noon until late afternoon, the block next to my schedule simply read, "Keep the kids stable." What made the coffee turn acidic in my stomach was the top row, the one assigning official titles to the family members. Under Delaney's name, bolded and highlighted in a soft gold color, were the words hostess and guest-facing duties. Everett was listed below her as beverage director, and right there in column 4. My name was printed with the title, Kids Coordinator. It was typed out with absolute chilling certainty, as if I had already signed a binding employment contract and agreed to all the operational terms. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of the spreadsheet, a text bubble from Delaney popped up in the chat. She typed with that breezy, passive-aggressive lightness she always employed when trying to disguise a direct command as a casual favor. She wrote that Everett had invited a few extra families from his corporate executive circle, so she really needed me to be a little flexible this year. The phrase, "a little flexible," was Delaney's favorite psychological weapon. It was a term that heavily implied I possessed an abundance of empty time and absolutely no personal boundaries worth respecting. The way she framed the message made it glaringly clear she viewed my total compliance not as a request, but as an absolute, non-negotiable given. I did not type a reply to the group chat. I set my coffee mug down, took a slow, deep breath to steady the erratic, angry beating of my heart, and dialed her phone number directly. She answered on the second ring, the loud whirring sound of an espresso machine echoing in her background. I kept my voice perfectly level and professional, utilizing the exact same tone I used when catching a contractor in a lie at work. I told her I had read the schedule. I stated, clearly and without raising my pitch, that I would be happy to make my signature potato gratin and bring it over to contribute to the meal. I told her I would arrive precisely at dinner time, I would dress elegantly for the occasion, and I would be perfectly polite to all of her important guests. However, I said, I would absolutely not be acting as a babysitter, and I would certainly not be arriving at 8:30 in the morning to serve as her unpaid logistics staff. The espresso machine stopped abruptly. A heavy, irritated silence fell over the line, thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, Delaney let out a sharp, condescending scoff. It was a harsh sound, specifically designed to make me feel incredibly small, like a petulant teenager throwing an unreasonable tantrum over chores. She told me I was making a massive deal out of absolutely nothing. She instantly adopted that syrupy, patronizing tone she usually reserved for correcting her toddlers. She insisted that the kids absolutely adored me, and that sitting with them for a few hours in the basement was not some monumental hardship. She claimed I was completely overreacting to a simple, helpful schedule meant to keep everyone sane during a busy event. Normally, I would feel the familiar urge to back down, to smooth things over, to swallow my justified anger just to maintain the fragile family peace. That was my designated historical role. But the glaring image of that spreadsheet, with my name permanently stamped under Kids Coordinator, burned brightly in my mind. For the very first time in my adult life, I did not dance around the issue. I did not soften my words with fake apologies or weak excuses about being tired from work. I told her the raw truth. I said that for years. I had not experienced a single genuine Thanksgiving holiday. I told her that my entire holiday experience, year after relentless year, had been hijacked and turned into a mandatory free shift of labor. I explained that while she got to sip expensive wine upstairs and play the perfect suburban hostess, I was permanently trapped downstairs managing emotional meltdowns, breaking up fights, and cleaning up spilled juice for children I did not choose to bring into the world. The syrupy tone vanished instantly from her voice. Delaney turned ice-cold and biting. The thin veneer of the stressed but loving older sister evaporated completely, leaving behind a hard, calculating edge. She told me that this dinner was absolutely crucial for Everett's upcoming promotion. She said that if I was not willing to be useful, if I was just going to sit around taking up space at the adult table and refusing to pitch in, then it would be best if I did not show up at all. She actually formed those exact words and directed them at me. She explicitly told me not to come if it meant I was going to make things awkward and difficult for the family in front of important corporate guests. I opened my mouth to reply, but a sudden shuffling sound came through the speaker, followed by a voice that made my jaw clench tight. Delaney had secretly put me on speakerphone. She was not alone in her kitchen. My mother's voice drifted through the line, heavily laced with that familiar, suffocating, guilt-inducing disappointment. Paula told me that Delaney was under an immense amount of pressure, that she had a massive household to run and a husband's vital career to support. My mother pointedly reminded me that Delaney had 2 children, and because I did not have any of those responsibilities, I needed to step up and be the bigger person. Then my father, Gerald, chimed in from the background. He grumbled loudly that I needed to act my age and stop being so incredibly difficult over a few hours of playing with kids. He utilized the exact same manipulative motif they had weaponized against me my entire life. They threw around heavy words like sacrifice and family duty and maturity, as if those noble concepts only ever applied in one single direction, always flowing outward from me and never returning. I stood completely still in my kitchen, listening to the 3 of them gang up on me through the tiny speaker of my cellular phone. It was a bizarre, almost out-of-body experience. They were all speaking at once, loudly weaving a fictional narrative where I was the selfish, destructive villain ruining a sacred family tradition simply because I refused to be treated like the hired help. They fully expected me to crumble under the combined weight of their disappointment. They expected me to start frantically apologizing, to promise I would be there at 8:30 sharp with a bright smile on my face, ready to serve. In the past, I would have desperately tried to explain myself. I would have outlined my stressful 60-hour work weeks, pleaded for just a little bit of basic understanding, and practically begged them to see my perspective. I would have sought their validation to prove I was not a bad daughter or a terrible sister. Not today. A profound, almost eerie calm washed over my entire body. I realized in that exact moment that trying to make them understand was a complete and utter waste of breath. They did not want to understand me. They merely wanted to use me. Any explanation I offered would just be twisted into another excuse they could bat away. I waited patiently for a brief pause in their collective, overlapping lecturing. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not let a single ounce of emotion bleed into my voice. I spoke one short, razor-sharp sentence that cleanly cut through the chaotic noise pouring out of the speakerphone. If I am only welcome as a babysitter, then I will not come. Before any of them could draw a breath to launch another wave of manipulation, I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red button to end the call, and tossed the device onto the kitchen counter. After the call ended, the silence in my kitchen was absolute and heavy. I stood perfectly still, staring at the blank screen of my cellular phone resting on the cool marble counter. I did not cry. There were no hot tears of betrayal burning my eyes, no shaking hands, no sudden, dramatic urge to smash a coffee mug against the wall. Instead, I felt a strange, icy clarity settling over my shoulders. The frantic, anxious energy that usually followed a confrontation with my family had completely vanished. In its place was the cold, methodical, calculating mindset I usually reserved strictly for my desk at Ravenport Transit Solutions when I caught a vendor trying to breach a contract. I walked into my home office, sat down in my ergonomic chair, and woke up my laptop. I opened my personal budget file. It was a complex, highly detailed financial spreadsheet I updated religiously every single Sunday morning. I navigated to the annual holiday expenditure tab, right-clicked on the grid, and inserted a brand new column. I typed the header in bold, black letters, money I stopped burning for others. Then, I began the audit. I opened my banking application on my secondary monitor and pulled up my credit card statements from November of the previous year, then the year before that, and the year before that. The numbers, when spelled out and staring back at me in stark black and white, were staggering. I went line by line, categorizing the phantom costs of my family's supposedly perfect holidays. There was the premium organic, heritage breed turkey Delaney had demanded 2 years ago when she decided she was hosting a rustic, farm-to-table themed dinner. She had promised to wire me the funds the exact moment I dropped the bird off at her house. She never did. I typed $185 into the new column. There were the artisan cheese boards, the imported crackers, and the 3 cases of sparkling cider from the specialty grocer. There were the heavy-duty, commercial-grade warming trays I had to purchase out of pocket because her chosen caterer fell through at the last minute and she panicked. Then, I looked at the specific expenses dedicated purely to the kids' den. I had essentially funded an entire miniature carnival in her basement year after year. Finger paints, construction paper, premium organic juice boxes, holiday-themed cookies, and a supposedly temporary rental fee for a massive indoor inflatable bounce house that Delaney's husband, Everett, swore on his life he would reimburse me for the second his year-end corporate bonus cleared. He never brought it up again, and I had been too polite to ask. I added the cost of the premium unleaded gas spent running frantic errands across 3 different counties on the Wednesday before the holiday. I added the emergency grocery runs for forgotten sticks of butter and extra heavy cream. I added all the little temporary advances that had silently dissolved into the ether of family obligation. When I finally highlighted the column of cells and let the software calculate the sum for just the past 3 Thanksgiving holidays, the total made my breath catch in my throat. It was nearly $2,500. That was the exact amount I had been desperately trying to scrape together to repair the sagging roof over my front porch. I had been delaying that necessary repair for 18 months, telling myself I needed to be more frugal, that I needed to save more diligently. All the while, the money was quietly bleeding out of my accounts to fund a luxurious lifestyle I did not even get to participate in. The more I scrolled through the historical financial data, the more the cold realization crystallized in my mind. I had never been occasionally helping out a stressed older sister. I was not a supportive sibling pitching in during a tough holiday season. I had been systematically institutionalized into their household ecosystem as a walking, breathing emergency fund. I was a limitless credit line that never charged interest and never sent a collection notice. I minimized the spreadsheet and opened a new secure browser tab. It was time to sever the supply lines. I logged into my preferred quick payment application on my phone. I navigated to Delaney's user profile. For years, she had been permanently pinned to the top of my frequent contacts list. I went into the application settings and removed her entirely. I disabled the instant transfer feature linked to her phone number and blocked any incoming request notifications from her account. Next, I tackled the shared online retail account. Years ago, when I was fresh out of college and trying to be helpful, I had added my primary credit card to my parents' household delivery account to purchase a Mother's Day gift, and somehow, my payment information had just stayed there. Over the years, I had noticed small, random charges appearing on my statements. A bulk pack of premium diapers shipped directly to Ash Creek Estates, a digital movie rental on a random Friday night, a fancy stainless steel coffee frother. I had always brushed them off, swallowing my irritation and telling myself it was not worth starting a massive family fight over $20 or $30. Today, I clicked on the payment methods dashboard. I found my card, verified the last 4 digits that I knew by heart, and I hit delete. A tiny confirmation window popped up on the screen asking if I was absolutely sure I wanted to remove this payment method. I clicked yes with zero hesitation. There was one final loose end to tie up. 3 days ago, Operating on pure, ingrained, subservient habit, I had placed a massive bulk order at a warehouse club. It included 24 folding chairs, 50 heavy-duty decorative paper plates, and 5 assorted boxes of bulk snacks meant specifically for the children's basement area. I had placed the order while sitting in my office, sighing and thinking. I will just help out this one last time, just to keep the peace and get through the week. I logged into the warehouse portal, navigated to my pending orders list, and clicked cancel. The screen refreshed a second later, confirming the cancellation was successful and the refund would be processed to my account in 3 to 5 business days. For the very first time in my adult life, as I systematically dismantled my financial utility to my family, I felt absolutely zero guilt. The heavy, suffocating blanket of obligation that usually weighed down my chest had been entirely lifted, right on cue, as if sensing a catastrophic disturbance in her supply chain. My phone began to buzz frantically against the wood of my desk. The incoming messages hit my lock screen in rapid succession, a highly coordinated digital assault from 3 different directions. The first was a massive, dramatic paragraph from Delaney. She accused me of actively trying to ruin our sacred family traditions out of sheer, unadulterated spite. She typed that she was currently sobbing in her kitchen, completely overwhelmed by the logistics, and that my sudden, shocking selfishness was going to humiliate Everett in front of his regional director. She demanded I call her back immediately, apologize for my tantrum, and confirm what time I was picking up the folding chairs. 2 minutes later, a separate message arrived from my mother. It was shorter, but dripping with her signature brand of soft, religious manipulation. She wrote that she did not raise me to be so cold and calculating. She said she was praying I would find it in my heart to stop being so stubborn, to put my petty grievances aside, and just support my sister during a critical time for her husband's career. Finally, a single, devastating line came through from my father. He wrote that he was deeply disappointed that I was choosing to count pennies with my own flesh and blood, and that family does not keep a ledger. I stared at his message for a long, quiet time. It was a fascinating piece of psychological projection. My father was actively shaming me for treating family like a financial transaction. Yet his entire argument was based on the underlying premise that I owed them my unpaid labor and my money by default. That was the exact moment the final puzzle piece snapped firmly into place. I realized with absolute clarity that the first person to introduce money and transactions into this relationship was never me. It was them. They were the ones who saw my stable income and my free time as communal household assets. They were the ones keeping a rigorous, invisible ledger of everything I supposedly owed them to make up for the crime of being unmarried and childless. The only difference was that they never used ugly, corporate words like debt or invoice. They masked their exploitation with beautiful, noble words like sacrifice, family bond, and helping out during hard times. They weaponized the concept of love to extract free resources. I reached out, turned my phone on silent, flipped it face down on the desk, and leaned back in my chair. The chaos they were desperately trying to project onto me felt incredibly distant, as if it were happening on another planet. My townhouse was quiet, safe, and entirely mine. I decided right then and there exactly what my Thanksgiving holiday would look like this year. I was not going to run back and forth across 3 different counties carrying heavy warming trays. I was going to stay right here in Millstone Ridge. I would cook a small, deliberate meal just for myself. I would make the roasted Brussels sprouts with thick balsamic glaze that Everett always vetoed because he claimed he hated the smell. I would bake a miniature rustic apple tart instead of a massive, labor-intensive pumpkin pie. I would pour myself a generous glass of dry red wine, sit at my own solid oak dining table, and eat my food while it was actually hot. In my mind, locking my front door and cutting off the financial pipeline was the absolute end of the conflict. I genuinely believed I was simply breaking a toxic, long-standing cycle of passive-aggressive use. It felt like a solid, final victory over a lifetime of being treated like a doormat. I had absolutely no idea that this quiet rebellion in my home office was merely the prelude. I did not yet know that while I was busy auditing old grocery bills and canceling warehouse orders, Delaney had already taken things a massive step further. I had no clue that in just a few short hours, I would discover my sister had not just planned to use my physical labor for free, she had actively weaponized my name to construct a much larger, far more sinister stage play for her perfect holiday. I was sitting in my living room, the silence of my townhouse wrapping around me like a protective blanket, when my phone vibrated against the armrest of the sofa. The screen lit up with a new message. It was not another barrage of guilt from my parents or a frantic demand from my sister. The name on the notification was Tessa Pike. Tessa is a distant cousin on my father's side. We are not particularly close, but we have always shared a mutual, unspoken understanding at chaotic family reunions. She is a pragmatic, straightforward woman who works in human resources and possesses a low tolerance for manufactured drama. She was one of the few extended family members invited to Delaney's exclusive holiday dinner this year. I picked up the phone and opened the message. It read, "I am just double-checking the arrangements for Thursday. Are you really going to be the main babysitter for the entire evening? I already transferred the fee to Delaney, but I wanted to make sure you were actually okay with watching my two boys before I finalized my plans." I stared at the glowing words. The air in the room seemed to turn thin and cold. I read the sentence again, my eyes snagging on a specific phrase. I already transferred the fee. My fingers hovered over the digital keyboard. I typed back slowly, ensuring my tone was entirely neutral. I asked, "Tessa, what fee are you talking about?" A long, agonizing pause followed. I watched the typing indicator bubble appear, disappear, and appear again on the screen. Tessa was clearly hesitating, likely realizing she had just stepped onto the edge of a massive, hidden landmine. Finally, her reply came through, accompanied by 3 image attachments. She wrote, "Morgan, please tell me you know about this." I tapped on the first image. It was a screenshot of a private group message thread Delaney had created a few days prior. The members of the chat were Tessa and several other women I did not immediately recognize, likely the wives of Everett's corporate colleagues. I zoomed in on Delaney's opening text. She had employed a sickeningly sweet, overly professional tone, writing about how she wanted to provide a truly curated, relaxing holiday experience for the adults this year. She explained that to ensure the parents could fully enjoy the formal dinner and the wine pairings, she had taken the liberty of arranging on-site childcare. My stomach dropped as I swiped to the next screenshot. Here, Delaney outlined the logistics. She wrote that instead of everyone scrambling to find high-priced holiday sitters in their own neighborhoods, she was offering a comprehensive kids program right in her finished basement. Then came the financial demand. Delaney politely requested that each participating family send a contribution of $100 directly to her digital payment account to cover the premium snacks, the holiday crafts, and the professional supervision. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck as I swiped to the third and final screenshot. This was the one that made my blood freeze in my veins. A woman named Emily had replied to the group, asking if the person watching the children was certified or experienced. Since her youngest had a mild peanut allergy, Delaney's response was immediate and terrifyingly smooth. She wrote, "Oh, absolutely. My sister Morgan handles kids professionally in family settings, so everyone can relax. She is amazing with them and knows all the protocols." I sat completely paralyzed on my sofa. I read that specific sentence over and over until the words blurred together. My sister Morgan handles kids professionally. I had never agreed to this. I had never even been consulted. And I most certainly had never seen a single cent of this supposed child care contribution. I quickly switched back to my conversation with Tessa. I asked her point blank how many people were in that specific message thread and how many had actually paid the fee. Tessa replied instantly. She told me there were 5 families with children attending the dinner, including herself. She confirmed that after Delaney sent the message, she personally saw at least 4 other women reply with screenshots of their completed payment transfers. I did the math in my head. 5 families, $100 each. Delaney had quietly collected $500 in cash from her wealthy guests. She was actively monetizing my mere existence. The profound depth of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was not simply a matter of a spoiled older sister demanding free labor to make her party run smoothly. This was calculated fraud. Delaney had constructed an elaborate, highly lucrative lie, using my name, my face, and my presumed presence as the core product of her scheme. She had packaged my forced servitude into a premium amenity, sold it to her husband's colleagues, and pocketed the revenue to subsidize her extravagant hosting budget. She did not want me there to participate in a family holiday. She needed me there to deliver the service she had already sold to her clients. If I simply failed to show up, as I had planned just an hour ago, Delaney would not just be missing a free babysitter. She would be exposed to her guests for taking their money under false pretenses. But I knew exactly how my sister operated. If I vanished, she would never admit the truth. She would instantly spin a tragic narrative. She would tell those important corporate wives that her sister, the professional sitter, had suffered a sudden emergency, or worse, that I was simply a deeply unreliable person who had bailed at the very last second and ruined the evening for everyone. She would keep their money and completely destroy my reputation in the process. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the rising tide of panic and fury down into a tight, manageable box in the corner of my mind. I could not afford to be emotional. I needed to be surgical. I typed a final response to Tessa. I thanked her for her honesty. I asked her, as a personal favor, to absolutely not mention this conversation to Delaney or anyone else. I promised her that the situation would be handled, but I needed complete silence from her end for the time being. Tessa, clearly sensing the sheer magnitude of the impending disaster, agreed immediately. I put my phone down and walked back into my home office. I opened my laptop and created a brand new, encrypted folder on my desktop. I named it November Disclosures. I logged into my email and my messaging applications, linking my phone directly to my computer. I began the meticulous process of digital preservation. I dragged and dropped Tessa's screenshots into the new folder. I scrolled back through my own text history with Delaney, capturing the exact timestamp of the moment she sent me the commanding spreadsheet that labeled me the kids' coordinator. I took screenshots of her threatening messages telling me not to come if I refused to work. I documented the call log showing the exact duration of the ambush phone call with our parents. I was building an irrefutable chain of evidence. I treated it exactly like a breached contract at Ravenport Transit Solutions. Every single communication, every implied agreement, every financial transaction needed to be locked down and backed up. As I saved the final file, the true emotional weight of the discovery finally settled over me. It was a suffocating, hollow feeling. I stared at the screen, realizing what hurt the absolute most. It was not the stolen $500. It was the fundamental reality of how my sister viewed my humanity. Delaney did not see me as a younger sister. She did not see me as an independent woman with a demanding career, a mortgage, and a life of my own. To her, I was an inanimate resource. I was a tool that could be easily packaged, slapped with a professional label, and sold as a premium upgrade for her fancy dinner party. She had stolen my voice. She had hijacked my personal image and paraded it around in front of a crowd of wealthy strangers I had not even met yet. From that exact moment onward, the nature of the entire conflict shifted fundamentally. This was no longer a petty sibling squabble about babysitting or setting healthy holiday boundaries. The Thanksgiving dinner at Ash Creek Estates was no longer just a meal I was going to skip. It was a crime scene, and I was holding all the receipts. I closed the folder and shut down my laptop. The coldness inside me had solidified into something hard and unbreakable. My family thought they had successfully backed me into a corner. They thought my silence earlier that morning was a sign of my ultimate surrender. They were incredibly wrong. They had merely given me the precise coordinates of the stage they had built. Now, I knew exactly how I was going to tear it down. The phone vibrated against my palm. The caller identification displayed my parents' home landline. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow breath to anchor myself, before pressing the green button to accept the call. My father did not bother with a greeting. His voice came through the speaker low, harsh, and dripping with the kind of authoritative impatience he usually reserved for dealing with incompetent mechanics. "Do not stir the water," he ordered. It was not a request. "The guests are already locked in. The invitations have been accepted. If you force a last-minute change to the schedule now, you are going to make your sister lose face in front of very important people. Everett has a massive promotion on the line. This is not the time for you to throw a wrench into the gears just to prove a point." Before I could even formulate a response to his blatant dismissal of my autonomy, a small click echoed on the line. My mother had picked up the kitchen extension. "Sweetheart, please listen to your father," she said. Her tone was entirely different from his, yet somehow infinitely more manipulative. It was coded in that soft, fragile disappointment she wielded like a scalpel. "Delaney is just completely overwhelmed. You know how she gets when she wants everything to be nice for the family. She might have overstepped a tiny bit because of the pressure, but you really should not nitpick over details right now. If you pull out, you are going to ruin the harmony of the entire holiday." I stood in the center of my living room, staring at the blank wall opposite me. A few hours ago, I might have felt a familiar twinge of guilt. I might have questioned if I really was being too rigid, but Tessa's screenshots were still burning a hole in my memory. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted, and my parents were operating on outdated intelligence. This was no longer a petty argument over chores. This was a battle for my basic dignity, and I refused to play the role of the submissive crisis manager any longer. I kept my voice absolutely flat, completely devoid of the emotional hysteria they were expecting to hear. "Let me ask you both a very direct question," I said. "If Delaney has been actively collecting childcare fees from her wealthy guests by explicitly promising my professional services, exactly who was planning to hand that money over to me? And more importantly, why did absolutely no one think to ask for my consent before selling my time?" The silence that followed was profound. It was a heavy, suffocating dead air that stretched across the telephone line. Neither of them spoke. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in their hallway. That hesitation was everything I needed to know. They either already knew about her financial scheme and chose to ignore it, or they were just realizing the full, fraudulent extent of it in real time, but still wanted to sweep it under the rug because defending Delaney was simply easier than holding her accountable. "That is what I thought," I said quietly, and I ended the call. Almost immediately, my phone screen lit up with a rapid succession of text messages. Having failed to subdue me through our parents, Delaney was pivoting to a direct, vicious character assassination. The notification bubbles popped up one after another, each sentence sharper and more venomous than the last. She wrote that I was deliberately trying to blow a simple misunderstanding out of proportion. She accused me of being deeply, bitterly jealous of her perfectly stable marriage and her beautiful suburban life. She typed that the real reason I was causing this massive problem was because I simply could not stand it when all the attention in the room was not focused entirely on me. I read the insults with a bizarre sense of detachment. She was projecting her own insecurities so loudly it was almost deafening. She was the one who needed a flawless stage play to impress corporate strangers. She was the one monetizing my existence to fund her aesthetic. I did not write a long paragraph defending myself. I did not engage in a messy, emotional back-and-forth argument. I typed a single, definitive sentence and hit send. "From now on, do not use my name to promise anything." I tossed the phone onto the cushion and walked into my home office to clear my head. I sat at my desk and opened my personal email account, intending to delete some promotional spam. As I scrolled through my inbox, a subject line caught my eye. It was an automated confirmation from a high-end local event rental boutique. I frowned, clicking on the message. The email detailed a confirmed reservation for 4 solid wood high chairs, 6 industrial-grade chafing dish fuel sets, and 3 heavy-duty folding tables, all scheduled for delivery to Ash Creek Estates early Thursday morning. But the billing contact, the email address, and the primary phone number listed on the digital invoice were not Delaney's. They were mine. A cold wave of realization washed over me. I quickly typed the names of a few other local vendors into my inbox search bar. 2 more confirmation emails populated the screen. One was for a curated professional holiday craft station from an art supply store. The other was a secondary rental for specialized glassware. Delaney had not used her own contact information for these crucial logistical pillars of her perfect party. She had used mine. Because I lived in the area, because I meticulously paid every single bill on time, and because my credit profile was spotless, these vendors knew my name. I was a trusted, reliable client. Delaney had exploited my solid reputation to secure her bookings without having to put down hefty upfront security deposits. She had tethered me to her event with invisible, legal strings. If she failed to pay the final invoices, or if one of those expensive wooden high chairs was damaged by her guests, the vendors would not chase her. They would chase me. This was exactly the kind of liability trap I dismantled every single day at Ravenport Transit Solutions. I reached for my phone, my professional instincts taking complete control. I dialed the number for the event rental boutique first. A cheerful customer service representative answered. I provided the confirmation number and verified my identity. I need to make an immediate update to this account, I stated clearly. I am not the guarantor for this specific order, and I will not be present at the delivery address. You need to entirely remove my name, my phone number, and my email address from this contract. If the homeowner at Ash Creek Estates cannot provide their own direct contact information and a valid credit card for the security deposit by the end of the business day, you have my full authorization to cancel the delivery entirely. I made the second call to the art supply store, repeating the exact same process. I remained perfectly polite, deeply calm, and thoroughly documented every interaction. I was not screaming. I was not throwing a tantrum. I was simply executing a legal paper-trailed withdrawal from commitments I had never consented to in the first place. I was surgically extracting my liability from her fantasy. The shockwave of that calm withdrawal hit Ash Creek Estates less than 45 minutes later. My phone rang again. It was Delaney. I did not answer, letting it go straight to voicemail. Then came a text, then another. The arrogant, insulting tone from her previous messages was completely gone. In its place was genuine, unadulterated panic. She frantically typed that the rental company had just called her, demanding a new deposit and threatening to cancel the tables and chairs. She wrote that the craft vendor was refusing to deliver the kits without an updated liability signature. Her carefully constructed, flawless hostess persona was beginning to fracture. The grand illusion of her capability was crumbling, not because I had maliciously sabotaged her, but because the entire structural integrity of her event had always rested squarely on my shoulders. I was the load-bearing pillar she had taken for granted, and now the pillar had simply decided to step aside. For the first time in over a decade, I pushed a shopping cart through the local grocery store without a heavy, suffocating sense of impending dread weighing on my chest. I did not have a towering, color-coded list of demanding ingredients. I was not frantically searching for 30 units of premium artisan crackers or hunting down 5 specific, overpriced organic cheeses. I navigated the quiet aisles with a strange, buoyant lightness that almost felt entirely foreign to my body. I picked out a single, modest turkey breast, just enough for me to enjoy with perhaps a leftover sandwich the following day. I selected exactly 3 large russet potatoes, a handful of fresh green beans, a small glass jar of artisanal cranberry relish, and a miniature, individual-sized apple pie from the corner bakery section. On my way to the checkout register, I grabbed 1 bottle of crisp, non-alcoholic apple cider. My total came to exactly $34.12. I paid the cashier, pocketed my receipt, and walked out into the brisk November air. It was a profoundly mundane errand, yet it felt like the very first deep breath I had taken in several long, exhausting months. When I returned to my townhouse, I unpacked the single, lightweight canvas grocery bag. I walked over to the vintage record player in the corner of my living room and put on a vinyl record of soft, instrumental jazz, letting the warm, rhythmic saxophone notes fill the quiet space. I spent the next 2 solid hours engaged in the simple, methodical tasks of reclaiming my own home. I wiped down the kitchen windows until the glass practically disappeared, letting the pale, golden afternoon light flood across the countertops. I swapped out my everyday dining table runner for a thick, woven linen tablecloth in a rich shade of forest green. Every single physical motion, from polishing the brass sink faucet to neatly folding the cloth napkins, felt highly deliberate. I was not doing chores. I was engaging in a quiet act of emotional restoration. I was physically washing away the residual anxiety of Ash Creek Estates and fortifying the walls of my own private sanctuary. While the peeled potatoes were soaking in a ceramic bowl of cold water, my phone chimed softly from the kitchen island. It was a message from Nora Halpern. Nora is the senior compliance analyst who sits 2 desks down from me at Ravenport Transit Solutions. She is a fiercely intelligent, fiercely protective woman in her late 50s who had spent the last 5 years watching me drag myself into the corporate office on the Monday morning after Thanksgiving, looking visibly exhausted and entirely drained of life. I had texted her earlier that morning, briefly outlining the massive explosion regarding the vendor invoices and my firm decision to pull out of my sister's event entirely. I was feeling a tiny, lingering thread of doubt, wondering if I had perhaps been too harsh by pulling the plug so abruptly. Nora replied with a single, grounding paragraph that cut through all of my conditioned guilt. She told me to listen to her very carefully. She wrote, "You did not ruin the holiday. You just stopped letting them use you as the glue to hold their own broken pieces together." I read that specific sentence 3 or 4 times. It was a simple, profound truth that settled deeply into my chest, systematically dissolving the very last stubborn knot of inherited family obligation. Nora was right. I was not the wrecking ball. I was just the mortar that finally refused to bear the weight of a crooked wall. As the late afternoon slowly bled into the early evening, another message popped up on my digital screen. This one was from Evan Mercer, the widowed high school history teacher who lived in the townhouse unit directly across the shared courtyard from mine. Evan was a quiet, exceptionally gentle man with kind eyes and a known penchant for aggressive weekend lawn care. He wrote, "I hope I'm not intruding, but I got a little carried away baking for my holiday dinner with my eldest daughter tomorrow. I have about a dozen extra homemade sourdough dinner rolls. Would you like me to bring a few over for your dinner?" I stood leaning against the kitchen counter, staring at Evan's message, and a sudden, sharp ache materialized in the back of my throat. It was a bittersweet, highly concentrated pang of realization. Here was a man who owed me absolutely nothing. A neighbor whose entire relationship with me consisted of waving over the community mailboxes and briefly chatting about the changing weather patterns, and he was casually offering me warmth and inclusion. Nora, a corporate colleague, was offering me fierce emotional protection and validation. These people, my chosen family of circumstance, respected my boundaries and treated me with more inherent dignity than my own blood relatives ever had in 34 years. The casual, easy kindness of absolute outsiders threw the toxic, transactional nature of my own family into sharp, glaring relief. I typed a deeply grateful reply to Evan, happily accepting 4 of the sourdough rolls and promising to leave a generous slice of my miniature apple pie on his front porch in return. I poured myself a small glass of the chilled cider and sat down by the living room window, watching the cold wind strip the last few dry brown leaves from the oak trees outside. A seductive, highly peaceful idea began to take root in my mind. I realized I could just stay right here. I could turn my cellular phone completely off, slide the heavy metal deadbolt securely into place, and just disappear for the next 48 hours. I could let Delaney drown in the chaotic mess of her own making. I could let the elaborate, fraudulent stage she had built at Ash Creek Estates collapse entirely under its own heavy weight without me there to silently prop it up. It would be so incredibly easy to just vanish into the quiet, gray comfort of my townhouse and let the entire holiday pass in absolute, unbroken silence. But the universe, it seemed, was not quite ready to let me completely disengage. My phone vibrated aggressively against the wooden table. It was another message from Tessa. She had sent a brand new image attachment. I opened the file immediately. It was a fresh screenshot taken from the private guest group chat, timestamped just 10 minutes ago. One of the visiting mothers had asked a logistical question about where to drop off the children's heavy winter coats when they arrived at the house tomorrow. Delaney had replied to the wealthy woman with terrifying, delusional confidence. She wrote, "Just bring them straight down to the den. Morgan will manage the kids once dinner starts, so do not worry about a single thing." My grip tightened around the cold glass of cider. She was doubling down on the lie. Even after I had explicitly told her over the phone that I was not working, even after I had legally canceled the vital vendor contracts under my name, she was still actively selling my physical presence to her paying guests. She was still aggressively pushing the fraudulent narrative, completely confident that I would eventually cave under the immense social pressure and show up to save her, or that she could somehow manipulate the story if I failed to appear. If I chose the easy, quiet path and simply stayed home with my jazz music and my small turkey breast, I would be handing Delaney a massive, blank canvas. She would stand in her spotless, professionally decorated kitchen, look those important corporate guests directly in the eye, and invent a beautifully tragic, dramatic story about my complete unreliability. She would expertly paint herself as the resilient, victimized hostess who somehow managed to pull the elegant evening together despite her deeply troubled, selfish younger sister abandoning the family at the final hour. The actual truth of her financial scam would be buried completely under her expertly crafted, theatrical tears. I realized, with absolute, cold certainty, that the truth could not be left to defend itself in my absence. It needed to be guarded. It needed to be kept safely locked in my own hands, not left vulnerable and malleable in Delaney's mouth. I decided right then that I was going to attend the dinner, not to work, and certainly not to help. I was going to attend as a witness. I did not send a fiery warning text to my sister. I did not call my parents to complain about her ongoing lies. I simply downloaded the new screenshot from Tessa, moved it securely into the encrypted folder on my computer desktop, and locked the screen. I was not going to strike yet. I would let her build the tension. I would let her set the expensive dining table, pour the premium wine, and happily welcome her guests into the house of cards she had constructed with stolen money. I would wait patiently for the exact, precise moment when the audience was fully seated, and the lie was so massive it could no longer be twisted, before I finally pulled the pin and brought the entire thing crashing to the ground. The evening before the holiday, the atmosphere inside my townhouse felt thick, like the heavy, charged air right before a severe thunderstorm. The soft jazz I had played earlier was off, replaced by the low, steady hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a bitter November wind rattled the glass of my living room windows. Inside, the only source of light was the amber glow of the brass floor lamp standing in the corner. I was sitting on the sofa, a woven blanket draped over my knees, watching the glowing screen of my cellular phone resting on the coffee table. It had been vibrating relentlessly for the past 20 minutes. Delaney was calling. When I refused to answer the third consecutive call, a new icon popped up, indicating a newly recorded voicemail. I picked up the device, pressed the speaker icon, and set it back down on the wooden surface. Delaney's voice filled the quiet room. She sounded entirely unhinged. She was alternating between frantic tears and sharp, biting anger. She practically screamed into the microphone, complaining that the rental vendors were demanding completely new liability contracts and hefty immediate security deposits just to keep the delivery schedule. She cried that the basement corner was still entirely empty, the craft tables were not set up, and she had no idea how to coordinate the early arrivals tomorrow morning. Then, the tears abruptly vanished, replaced by venom. She accused me of intentionally trying to destroy her life. She said I was selfishly making everything a massive mess just to punish her for being a successful hostess. The recording ended with a sharp, aggressive click. I did not delete the message. I simply locked the screen. I knew the panic was real, but it was a panic born entirely of her own entitlement. She was a director who had suddenly lost her unpaid stagehand and was furious that the props were not moving by themselves. Less than 45 minutes later, The heavy brass knocker on my front door slammed twice. It was not a polite, neighborly tap. It was a firm, authoritative pounding that demanded immediate entry. I walked to the entryway and looked through the glass peephole. My parents were standing on my front porch, huddled together against the freezing wind. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. They stepped over the threshold, bringing a rush of freezing air and the faint smell of exhaust fumes into my quiet sanctuary. They carried the exact, frantic energy of an emergency response team arriving to extinguish a raging fire, but their sole objective was clearly to hand the heavy hose directly back to me. My father did not even bother taking off his wool coat. He stood in my foyer, his posture rigid and commanding. My mother stood slightly behind him, wringing her hands together in a theatrical display of maternal distress. "We are going into the living room," my father announced. Not asking for permission, I gestured toward the sofa, remaining standing myself. I crossed my arms over my chest, watching them settle awkwardly onto the edge of the cushions. The warm, ambient light cast long, dramatic shadows across their faces. They looked older, suddenly, but I felt no pity. My mother started the offensive. She leaned forward, using her softest, most pleading voice. She told me that this was the absolute worst possible time for me to start demanding fairness. She said families must unite during moments of crisis, not fracture over petty, individual grievances. She stressed that a holiday was about putting the collective good above personal pride. Before I could even dismantle her ridiculous argument, my father cut in. His voice was loud, echoing slightly against the high ceiling. He confessed the real reason for their late-night ambush. He stated that Everett had pulled massive strings to get his regional corporate director and the director's wife to attend this specific dinner. He told me, his face turning a dark shade of red, that if this evening slid off the tracks, the professional fallout would be catastrophic. He made it explicitly clear that the consequences of my rebellion would no longer be contained within a simple family argument. They would actively ruin his son-in-law's entire career trajectory. They stared at me, fully expecting me to crumble under the combined weight of their guilt and panic. They expected me to nod, apologize, grab my coat, and immediately drive to Ash Creek Estates to start setting up the folding chairs. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my breathing slow and completely even. I turned around, walked into my home office, and picked up the thick manila envelope I had prepared earlier that afternoon. I walked back into the living room and dropped it directly onto the solid oak coffee table, right between my father's knees. "Open it," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. My father frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his reading glasses, and slid them onto his nose. He opened the metal clasp of the envelope and pulled out the crisp, color-printed pages. My mother leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the text. I watched their expressions shift in real time. I had printed everything. The first page was the high-resolution spreadsheet assigning me the official title of Kids Coordinator. The second page contained the damning text message where Delaney explicitly threatened to kick me out of the dinner entirely if I refused to serve. The third and fourth pages were the legal vendor confirmations, clearly proving she had used my personal email and my financial reputation to secure her party supplies. But the final pages were the killing blow. They were the bright, undeniable screenshots from Tessa. They showed Delaney's exact words, boasting to the wealthy corporate wives about my professional services, followed by the explicit demands for the childcare fees and the subsequent digital payment confirmations. The silence in my living room became absolute. The only sound was the sharp, dry rustle of the paper as my father turned the pages with trembling fingers. For the very first time in my entire adult life, they had absolutely nowhere to hide. They could not brush this away as a simple sibling misunderstanding. They could not gaslight me into believing I was simply being too sensitive. The evidence sitting on my table was physical, highly specific, and utterly cold. It was a documented trail of calculated fraud. My father slowly took off his reading glasses. He looked down at his leather shoes, completely unable to meet my eyes. The authoritative, commanding presence he had carried into my home had completely evaporated. My mother, realizing that the aggressive tactic was completely dead, instantly pivoted. She shifted from harsh blame to desperate, weeping negotiation. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at me. She admitted, her voice trembling, that Delaney had behaved horribly. She agreed that charging the guests was a terrible, misguided mistake born out of immense social pressure. But then she reached out, trying to grab my hand. I stepped back out of her reach. She begged me not to do anything drastic tomorrow. She pleaded with me not to embarrass my sister in front of a house full of important strangers. She said, her voice breaking into a sob, that if I let this secret blow up in the middle of the dining room, the family dynamic would be shattered permanently. She whispered that once a scandal like this came to light, things could never go back to how they were. I looked down at her, feeling a strange, profound sense of peace. I finally understood the fundamental difference between us. They were terrified of the illusion breaking. I was terrified of living inside it for another 30 years. "You are absolutely right," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy air. Things can never go back to how they were, but the timeline of that destruction did not start today. Everything changed the exact moment she decided to package and sell my time to her guests without bothering to ask for my consent. She shattered the family dynamic when she turned me into a product. I took a deliberate step forward, forcing them both to look up at me. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable younger daughter. I was the one holding all the power in the room, and I was setting the terms of surrender. "I am going to give you my final condition," I stated. "I am going to attend that dinner tomorrow, but I am arriving exactly at the scheduled time, and I am walking through the front door strictly as a guest. I will not step foot in that basement. I will not manage a single child. I will not coordinate the catering trays. I will sit at the table, I will eat the food, and I will be perfectly polite." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, ensuring they heard every single syllable of my next sentence. However, if Delaney tries to force me into servitude in front of her friends, or if she tells a single lie to cover up her missing babysitter, I will not pull her aside for a quiet chat. I will sit at that beautifully decorated table, and I will tell every single person in that room exactly where their money went. I will show them the receipts. My mother gasped softly, raising a hand to her mouth. My father just stared at me, his face pale and completely drained of fight. They knew I was not bluffing. The meticulously documented folder sitting on the table proved I was entirely capable of burning the stage to the ground. They reluctantly agreed. They promised, their voices weak and hollow, that they would speak to Delaney tonight. They swore they would keep her completely in check and ensure no one bothered me about the children. I watched them walk out of my front door and shuffle back to their car in the freezing wind. I locked the deadbolt behind them. I knew the truth as I turned off the porch light. They had not agreed to my terms because they suddenly respected my boundaries or felt remorse for my mistreatment. They promised to control her simply because they were absolutely terrified of me. They realized I was finally willing to do the one thing they could not control, which was to speak the ugly, unfiltered truth in a room full of people they desperately wanted to impress. The storm had not passed. It was merely waiting for the guests to arrive. I woke up at exactly 7 in the morning on Thanksgiving Day. There were no frantic alarms blaring in the dark, no rushed showers, and absolutely no panic about loading my trunk with heavy folding chairs. I brewed a pot of French press coffee, poured a cup, and stood by my living room window, watching the pale morning sun slowly melt the frost off the bare branches outside. I took my time. I ate a slice of toast. Then, I walked into my kitchen to pull my small, deliberately portioned potato gratin from the oven. The bubbling cream and golden, toasted cheese smelled incredibly comforting. When it was time to get ready, I completely bypassed the section of my closet holding the comfortable, stain-resistant clothes I had worn to every family gathering for the past decade. I did not put on the flat, rubber-soled shoes meant for chasing toddlers across concrete floors. Instead, I chose a tailored, dark emerald green dress that fell gracefully just below my knees, paired with sheer black tights and polished leather ankle boots. It was an outfit that explicitly stated I was an equal. It was clothing meant for sitting comfortably, sipping wine, and conversing with adults. It was not the uniform of the help. I pulled into the sweeping, immaculate driveway of Ash Creek Estates right at the scheduled dinner hour. The exterior of my sister's home looked exactly like a staged photograph from a luxury lifestyle magazine. A massive, professionally woven wreath of autumn foliage and dried orange slices hung perfectly centered on the heavy mahogany front door. When I stepped over the threshold, the air inside was thick and warm, heavily perfumed with the scent of expensive artisan cedar and clove candles. Delaney had clearly burned them to mask the faint, sharp smell of her own underlying panic. She had transformed the main floor into a flawless, glowing showroom. Calligraphy place cards rested perfectly on gold-rimmed plates in the formal dining room. The massive kitchen island was wiped entirely clean, bathed in the bright, unforgiving glow of the recessed lighting. But my eyes, trained by years of auditing complex transit contracts to spot discrepancies, immediately saw the frantic chaos writhing just beneath that polished surface. Everett was pacing aggressively back and forth in front of the double ovens, his tie completely loosened, muttering under his breath about the internal temperature of the heritage turkey rising far too slowly. In the corner of the dining room, there was a glaring, empty space where the rented wooden high chairs were supposed to be positioned. Two different guest families had completely ignored basic social etiquette and arrived at least 30 minutes early, bringing 3 small, hyperactive children who were currently running frantic, noisy circles around the pristine linen sofas. And then there was my sister. Delaney was standing near the grand entryway, her hair styled in effortless, cascading waves, wearing a pristine silk blouse. She was laughing at a joke an early guest had made, but her smile was stretched so tightly across her face it looked physically painful. Her eyes were wide, darting nervously around the room, tracking every single moving part of her crumbling production. I walked quietly into the kitchen, placed my small ceramic baking dish on a side counter, and smoothed the skirt of my dress. Delaney spotted me instantly. For a fraction of a second, a flash of pure relief washed over her strained features, immediately followed by her familiar, silent commands. She widened her eyes, tilted her head sharply toward the hallway, and gave a frantic, jerking nod, pointing directly toward the basement stairs. It was the exact same silent, dismissive language she had used for years to banish me from sight. I looked directly into her frantic eyes, offered a polite, completely serene smile, and turned my back to her. I walked straight into the formal living room, greeted a couple I vaguely recognized from a previous holiday, and sat down gracefully in a plush velvet armchair, right in the center of the adult space. I crossed my legs, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. I made myself an immovable object. A few minutes later, Tessa materialized silently beside my chair. She held a crystal glass of sparkling water, her expression tight and incredibly uncomfortable. She leaned down, pretending to admire the rich fabric of my dress, and kept her voice at a barely audible whisper. She told me that 2 more mothers had just cornered her in the downstairs powder room to eagerly ask about the timeline for the childcare arrangements. They had both transferred the requested funds to Delaney that very morning and were fully expecting the structured, professional supervision they had paid for so they could finally relax. The invisible, fraudulent financial web my sister had spun was pulling tighter around her own neck with every single guest that walked through her front door. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door opened again, and Everett practically sprinted across the hardwood floor to greet the new arrivals. It was his regional corporate director and his wife, a striking, impeccably dressed woman who immediately commanded the quiet attention of the entire room. Delaney rushed forward, her strained, painful smile magically transforming into a flawless mask of glowing, gracious hospitality. She took their heavy winter coats, offering a perfectly rehearsed welcome. I remained seated in my velvet armchair, perfectly positioned to observe the interaction. The director's wife looked around the grand room, noting the children sprinting past the coffee table, and politely asked how Delaney managed to host such an incredibly elegant evening with so many young ones running around. Delaney did not even hesitate. She laughed a light, breezy, musical laugh that made my stomach physically turn. I heard her exact words floating clearly across the quiet room. "Oh, do not worry about a thing," Delaney said smoothly. "My sister is amazing with children. She always takes over so the adults can actually enjoy themselves." She delivered the massive lie with such practiced, terrifying ease. She actively pitched my exploitation as a heartwarming point of family pride, selling my forced absence as a premium amenity to a woman she desperately wanted to impress. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with my father. He was standing near the stone fireplace, a heavy crystal glass of bourbon clutched tightly in his hand. The absolute second our eyes met, he flinched. He quickly looked down at his leather shoes, then turned his entire body to face the wall, pretending to study a framed painting. My mother was suddenly very busy across the room, aggressively arranging invisible crumbs on the appetizer table, absolutely refusing to look in my direction. Their cowardice was profound and complete. They had clearly not spoken to Delaney the night before. They had not set any boundaries. They had walked into this house and immediately folded, deciding to play along with her delusion. They were desperately hoping that I would eventually break under the immense social pressure, stand up from my chair, and quietly march down those basement stairs just to save the family from public embarrassment. I uncrossed my legs, reached into my small leather clutch, and pulled out my cellular phone. The screen illuminated my face with a soft, pale light. I did not feel a single ounce of anger anymore. I felt incredibly cold and incredibly focused. I opened my digital photo gallery to verify that the dedicated folder of preserved evidence was easily accessible. Then, I opened my messaging application and navigated to the large group chat Delaney had created 3 weeks prior to coordinate all the adult guests attending the dinner. I tapped the empty text box. I did not type out a long, highly emotional essay. I kept my thumb steady as I composed a short, clinical, and devastatingly clear message. I attached the crisp screenshots of Delaney's financial demands. I attached her color-coded spreadsheet. I attached the threatening messages she had sent me the previous day. I crafted the text to explain, with absolute professional detachment, that I had never consented to providing childcare. I had never received a single dollar of the collected fees, and I would be participating in the evening strictly as a guest. I stared down at the flashing cursor on the screen. I did not press send, not yet. I had not come to Ash Creek Estates to throw a spontaneous, screaming tantrum in the foyer. I came to give my sister one final, silent opportunity to stop herself, if she chose to come clean, to quietly refund her guests, and to treat me as a human being at the dinner table. The message would be deleted entirely. But I also needed the absolute insurance. I needed to ensure that when the truth finally detonated in this house, it could not be dismissed as a sudden, crazy outburst from a jealous younger sister. The evidence was loaded, targeted, and resting quietly right under my thumb. The trap was fully set. All I had to do now was sit in my velvet chair, wait for Delaney to formally call everyone to the beautifully set table, and see if she would be foolish enough to try and push me into the dark one last time. By 6:30 in the evening, the grand living room of Ash Creek Estates was filled to absolute capacity. The ambient noise of overlapping conversations, the sharp clinking of heavy crystal wine glasses, and the chaotic, heavy footsteps of children running across the hardwood floors created a deafening, suffocating hum. Delaney was entirely in her element. She practically floated from one small circle of guests to another, expertly balancing a delicate glass of red wine in her hand. She was actively performing the role of the ultimate family matriarch. I watched from my quiet corner as she spun sweet, entirely fabricated stories about our childhood. She spoke passionately about deep-rooted family traditions, loudly declaring how incredibly close we all were, and how she took immense personal pride in keeping the extended family so tightly woven together. I stood up from my velvet armchair to stretch my legs and slowly made my way toward the open kitchen to refill my glass of sparkling water. The caterers had not yet brought out the main courses, but the massive marble island was already crowded with empty appetizer plates and discarded cocktail napkins. As I reached for the water pitcher, my eyes locked onto a small, thick paper envelope resting casually near the edge of the granite counter. Right next to a decorative bowl of autumn gourds, my breath caught in my throat. I leaned in slightly, reading the elegant, sweeping cursive handwriting scrawled across the front of the pristine white paper. It read, "Kids' Activities and Sitter Fund." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it made my pulse hammer loudly in my ears. Delaney was not merely satisfied with the digital transfers she had silently extorted from her friends prior to the dinner. She had actually set out a physical collection point. She was actively receiving cash on the exact same day, right in the middle of her kitchen, double-dipping into the pockets of her wealthy guests. I could clearly see the thick green edges of $20 bills peeking out from the unsealed flap. She was running a highly lucrative, entirely fraudulent business operation right in front of my face, using my physical presence as her absolute guarantee. Before I could even step away from the kitchen island, a young, impeccably dressed couple approached me. The man was holding a fussy toddler against his chest, while the woman looked deeply exhausted, clutching a diaper bag over her shoulder. They offered me a warm, eager smile. The woman spoke in a hushed, relieved tone. She introduced herself as one of the wives of Everett's junior executives. She said Delaney had pointed me out from across the room and told them I was the one handling the entire schedule for the children tonight. She asked me, her eyes practically begging for a break, what exact time I would be taking the kids downstairs to the basement den so she and her husband could finally sit down and enjoy a quiet, adult conversation. I looked at the tired mother. I felt a sharp pang of genuine sympathy for her. Recognizing that she was just another innocent victim of my sister's elaborate financial scam, I did not glare at her. I did not raise my voice or act offended. I simply offered her a perfectly polite, entirely serene smile. I kept my voice gentle, but incredibly firm. I told her she must have misunderstood the arrangements. I stated clearly that I was merely a guest at the dinner table tonight, just like she was. I advised her to go directly to the hostess and ask Delaney to clarify who was actually hired to manage the childcare, because it certainly was not me. The profound confusion that washed over the young mother's face was immediate. She blinked, looking from me to her husband, completely lost. But before she could ask another question, a tight, vicious grip clamped down heavily onto my upper arm. Delaney had materialized out of nowhere. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug painfully through the fabric of my emerald green dress. Her face was entirely flushed, and the sweet, flawless hostess smile she had been wearing just seconds ago was completely gone, replaced by a mask of sheer panic and furious desperation. She excused us to the young couple with a sharp, breathless laugh, claiming we needed to check on the catering trays. Then, using her absolute full body weight, she yanked me backward, dragging me forcefully into the massive walk-in kitchen pantry and shoving the heavy wooden door completely shut behind us. The air inside the pantry was stifling, smelling heavily of dried herbs and imported olive oil. The bright overhead light cast harsh shadows across Delaney's face. She backed me up against a shelf of canned goods, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. She did not yell. Yelling would have drawn the attention of the guests lingering just outside the door. Instead, she leaned in incredibly close, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous whisper that practically vibrated with rage. She told me that I was actively ruining everything. She hissed that if I did not immediately walk out there, smile, and take those kids down to the basement right this very second, Everett was going to lose his promotion. She swore to me that she would make a massive scene, that she would humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood, and that she would make sure I regretted this exact moment for the rest of my miserable, lonely life. She demanded my absolute obedience, leveraging the entire weight of her husband's career and our family's reputation against my silence. I stood perfectly still, my back resting comfortably against the wooden shelving. I did not try to pry her hands off my arm, I did not shrink away from her furious face. I looked directly into her frantic, wildly darting eyes. All the years of passive acceptance, all the decades of swallowing my pride just to keep the peace, were completely gone. I felt incredibly tall. I gave her my answer. It was short. It was absolute. I already warned you. I did not threaten her back. I did not raise my pitch to match her hysteria. It was precisely that profound, unshakable calmness that finally made her realize the absolute gravity of the situation. Delaney let go of my arm as if the fabric of my dress had suddenly caught fire. She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing silently, utterly terrified because she had entirely lost her lifelong ability to control my actions. She spun around, pushed the heavy pantry door open, and practically fled back into the bright, crowded kitchen. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the wrinkled sleeve of my dress, and followed her out at a measured, graceful pace. By the time I stepped back into the formal dining room, Delaney had somehow managed to staple her flawless, glowing smile back onto her face. The massive dining table was fully set. The caterers were bringing out the heavy silver platters of steaming food. The guests were beginning to find their assigned seats, the ambient noise lowering into a warm, anticipatory murmur. Delaney picked up a crystal wine glass and tapped it lightly with a silver spoon. The sharp, high-ringing sound instantly silenced the entire room. All eyes turned toward the hostess standing at the head of the magnificent table. She welcomed everyone with a grand, sweeping gesture. She thanked them for coming to share this beautiful holiday. And then, with an audacity so massive it practically sucked the oxygen straight out of the room, she looked directly at the crowd and delivered the final, fatal lie. She announced that after everyone finished their main courses, her wonderful sister Morgan would be gathering all the children and taking them down to the lower level. She promised the parents that they would have plenty of uninterrupted time to enjoy their dessert and the expensive wine pairings. Because everything was perfectly handled, I watched the entire room react. The corporate wives nodded in deep appreciation. The tired parents let out audible sighs of profound relief. They were reacting exactly to the premium product they had purchased. It was the exact image Delaney had sold them from the very beginning. I stood near my velvet chair, taking a highly methodical inventory of the room. I looked at my parents. My father was staring intently at his plate, absolutely paralyzed by cowardice. My mother was nervously twisting a cloth napkin in her lap, fully aware of the lie but choosing to remain entirely silent. I looked at Everett, who seemed genuinely exhausted, but completely oblivious to the fraudulent financial scheme his wife had orchestrated right under his nose. I looked at the wealthy, unsuspecting guests who were eagerly waiting for their perfect, peaceful dinner. Finally, I looked at the small children sitting at the edges of the room, entirely innocent in this massive, ugly game of adult manipulation. I realized with absolute clarity that if I remained silent for one single minute longer, Delaney's desperate lie would officially become the concrete truth in the eyes of every single person present. I walked slowly over to my assigned seat at the long table. I pulled my cellular phone out of my clutch. I placed it face down on the polished wood, right next to my gold-rimmed plate. I took one final, incredibly deep breath, letting the heavy, perfumed air fill my lungs. I made my final decision. The explosion that was about to shatter this perfect suburban illusion would not be fueled by a screaming match. It would not be a messy, emotional breakdown. The absolute destruction of Delaney's stage would come from the cold, undeniable truth, delivered to the exact right people, at the exact right moment. And that moment had officially arrived. The guests settled into their assigned seats around the massive dining table, the heavy mahogany chairs scraping softly against the polished hardwood floor. The caterers had just finished placing the grand steaming turkey in the center, surrounded by elegant silver platters of roasted vegetables and artisan stuffing. The ambient chatter of the wealthy corporate wives and junior executives lowered into a comfortable, expectant hum. Delaney remained standing at the head of the table. She picked up her crystal wine glass, her face glowing with the radiant, flawless smile of a woman who believed she had successfully orchestrated the perfect evening. She cleared her throat gently, waiting for absolute silence to fall over the room before she began her toast. She spoke beautifully about gratitude, blessing the abundance of the food and the incredible company of Everett's esteemed colleagues. Then, right on cue, she pivoted gracefully toward the theme of family. She looked directly at me down the length of the table. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes were cold and demanding. "I am just so incredibly grateful that our family always knows how to seamlessly divide the work," Delaney announced, her voice echoing clearly off the high ceiling. "It takes a village to make a beautiful night like this happen. So, right after we finish these amazing appetizers, Morgan is going to gather the little ones and head downstairs, so all of you hardworking parents can finally take a breath and enjoy yourselves." It was a public, inescapable trap. She was silently daring me to ruin the elegant atmosphere. She fully expected me to lower my head, stand up from my chair, and quietly walk away to preserve her flawless image in front of the regional director. I did not move a single muscle. I did not stand up. I did not avert my gaze. I reached down, picked up my cellular phone resting face down beside my gold-rimmed plate, and unlocked the screen. The group message containing every single adult sitting at this table was already open. The massive block of text, along with the digital evidence, was already fully loaded in the composition box. I looked right back at my sister, kept my face completely devoid of any emotion, and pressed send. For 2 painfully long seconds, nothing happened. Then, a synchronized, chaotic chorus of digital chimes, vibrations, and notification bells erupted around the entire dining table. Almost every guest instinctively reached for their device. The wealthy mother sitting to my left tapped her screen. Everett pulled his phone from his suit jacket. The regional director's wife casually glanced at her device resting near her water glass. I watched the temperature of the room drop by 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. The soft, elegant atmosphere froze completely solid. Eyes darted rapidly across glowing screens, absorbing the color-coded spreadsheet labeling me the kids' coordinator, the vicious text message where Delaney told me not to come if I refused to work, and, most devastatingly, the clear screenshots of Delaney demanding and receiving childcare fees using my name. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and incredibly absolute. No one was looking at their expensive appetizers anymore. One by one, their eyes slowly lifted from their screens and locked directly onto Delaney. The mother sitting to my left was the very first to break the silence. Her voice was no longer tired. It was sharp and deeply offended. "Delaney," she said, her tone slicing through the dead air. "Where exactly did the $100 I sent you this morning go?" Another mother across the table chimed in immediately, her face flushed with anger. "You told me she was a certified professional. You told us you hired her." Everett was staring at his phone, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a speeding vehicle. He looked up at his wife, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated shock. "Delaney, what childcare fee?" Everett demanded. "What are they talking about?" "You charged my boss for a babysitter." The regional director's wife did not say a single word. She simply placed her linen napkin on the table and looked at Delaney with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. She was looking at my sister as if she were a completely different person, a stranger who had just tried to pick her pocket in her own dining room. Delaney panicked. Her flawless mask completely disintegrated, leaving behind a frantic, cornered animal. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, and desperately tried to spin the narrative back onto her favorite target. "Morgan, this is completely insane," Delaney stammered, her voice shrill and trembling. "You are being incredibly petty. You are trying to ruin a beautiful holiday over a tiny, stupid misunderstanding just because you are jealous." I did not raise my voice to shout over her. I simply reached into the leather envelope resting on my lap and pulled out the thick stack of printed financial receipts I had compiled the night before. I tossed them onto the center of the table. They fanned out across the pristine linen, landing right next to the silver gravy boat. "This is not a misunderstanding," I stated, my voice projecting clearly to every corner of the room. "And it is certainly not about today. Those papers detail over $2,500 in groceries, emergency catering deposits, folding chairs, and unreturned loans that I have paid for out of my own pocket to fund your parties over the last 5 years. You did not just ask for my help today. Delaney, you built a system of financial exploitation, and today, you finally decided to charge your own guests for the privilege of using me." My father, Gerald, closed his eyes. The fight completely drained out of him. He was a man who cared deeply about appearances, and the physical, undeniable evidence sitting on the table in front of Everett's corporate superiors was a humiliation he could not argue against. "She is right, Paula," my father whispered heavily, not looking at his wife. "Morgan has carried too much for too long. We knew it." My mother sat completely frozen, her mouth slightly open, utterly speechless. She had absolutely no soft, manipulative words left to salvage the wreckage. The final nail in the coffin came from Tessa. She leaned forward, looking directly at the other furious mothers. "I am the one who sent Morgan the screenshots. I transferred the money yesterday because Delaney explicitly told me Morgan was being properly compensated. We were all lied to." The true explosion of the holiday did not feature anyone flipping a table or throwing a wine glass. It was the terrifying, silent collapse of a false reality. The masks fell off in perfect unison. Everett finally saw the staggering magnitude of his wife's deceit. The wealthy guests realized they had been actively defrauded to subsidize a suburban aesthetic. And my parents, trapped under the glaring lights of public scrutiny, could no longer dismiss my firm boundaries as a dramatic overreaction. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly. I picked up the small ceramic dish containing my potato gratin and moved it respectfully to the side buffet table. "I am not going to argue with anyone," I said, my voice incredibly calm. "I simply refuse to continue being the invisible labor for a family that only remembers I exist when they need someone to absorb their costs and take the fall. Enjoy your evening." I turned my back on the stunned, completely paralyzed dining room. I walked out the front door, leaving Delaney standing in the absolute chaotic ruins of the stage she had built with stolen money. When I finally unlocked the door to my own townhouse, the contrast was staggering. The air inside was warm, smelling beautifully of cinnamon and toasted bread. I walked into the kitchen and found Nora standing by my island, holding a bottle of dry red wine. Evan and his teenage daughter were at the dining table, setting down a basket of fresh steaming sourdough rolls and a massive, homemade pecan pie. They had texted me earlier, and when I told them what I was about to do, they had simply come over to ensure I did not spend the aftermath alone. My phone was vibrating relentlessly on the counter, filling up with frantic, desperate voicemails from Everett apologizing profusely, weeping messages from my mother, and stunned texts from my father. I did not listen to a single one. I powered the device completely off and tossed it into a drawer. I sat down at my own table, surrounded by people who respected me, and poured myself a glass of wine. For the first time in my entire life, I had a genuine Thanksgiving. It was not the tragic day I lost my family. It was the beautiful, empowering day I simply stopped being the necessary price to keep them standing. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support it further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.